Story number 1.
The church in our small town had always been a place of quiet reverence. Nestled on a hill at the edge of town, it stood as a silent sentinel, weathered by years of storms and the passing of time. Though it had been there for over a century, few people in the town ever went inside anymore. The doors had been locked for as long as I could remember, and the few locals who had been inside as children often spoke of it with an odd mix of reverence and fear. They spoke of Father Hughes, the priest who had served there for many years before he mysteriously vanished, never to be seen again. It wasn't long after Father Hughes's disappearance that the church had been sealed off. The doors remained locked, the windows boarded up. People whispered about strange sounds coming from within, faint organ music late at night, shadows moving behind the glass, rumors that kept most people away. But to me, the church was a curiosity, a relic of a past that seemed to fade further with each passing year. I moved to the town about a year ago. I'd come to take a position at the local historical society, and the church became one of my first points of interest. I wanted to learn about its history, to uncover the truth behind the rumors that had followed it for decades. I was a researcher by nature, and I didn't put much stock in ghost stories. What interested me was the tangible, the history, the records, the facts. I thought perhaps there was a logical explanation for all of it. I began my investigation by speaking with a few elderly townsfolk who were still around. They spoke of Father Hughes with a sort of reverence. He had been a kind man, they said, a pillar of the community. But the night he disappeared, something had changed. A few people told me that they had heard voices coming from the church in the days leading up to his vanishing. Whispers, urgent, low, like a conversation happening behind closed doors. Others spoke of strange lights in the windows flickering and dimming, as though the church itself was alive with some unseen force. I wasn't sure what to make of all of it, but it was enough to keep my curiosity piqued. The next step, I thought, was to visit the church myself. I had to see it with my own eyes to get a sense of the place. One crisp autumn afternoon, I made my way to the church. The trees had already begun shedding their leaves, the ground covered in a blanket of gold and amber. The church loomed in the distance, its steeple piercing the sky, its stone walls aged and worn. As I approached, the silence seemed to deepen. Even the birds, which usually filled the air with their songs, had gone quiet. The churchyard was overgrown, with weeds creeping up around the stone walls of the cemetery. The gravestones, some of them centuries old, were tilted and weathered, names and dates barely legible. I felt a strange heaviness in the air as I approached the church doors. They were made of thick, ancient wood, their surfaces chipped and scarred. The metal handles were cold to the touch as I grasped them, but the doors wouldn't budge. I tried several times, but they were locked tight. I wasn't surprised. The church had been locked for years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to see inside. The urge to push forward to find a way in was overwhelming. I circled the church looking for any gap, any way to peek inside, but there was nothing. The windows were boarded up, and the back door was equally locked. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. A narrow, weathered door at the side of the building was slightly ajar. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it. It must have been hidden by ivy or some other overgrowth. The door seemed to beckon, its crack wide enough to allow me to slip through if I was careful. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door. There was a part of me that knew this was a bad idea, but the curiosity inside me was too strong to ignore. I pushed the door open slowly, the old hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The faint light from outside filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows on the stone floor. I could barely make out the outlines of pews, their seats worn and cracked. The air was still, suffocating almost, and the silence felt oppressive, as if the church had not heard the sound of human footsteps in decades. I moved cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went into the church, the more the temperature seemed to drop. I felt a chill creeping up my spine, but I forced myself to keep going. I was determined to find something, to uncover the mystery of this place. As I reached the altar, I stopped. There, lying in the center of the altar table, was an old, tarnished candlestick. It was the only object that seemed out of place in the otherwise barren church. I stepped closer to inspect it, but as I did, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. A faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to drift from somewhere deeper in the church. I stood perfectly still, listening. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Help! Help me!" I felt my blood run cold. The voice was so faint, yet so unmistakable, that I could not deny it. The sound came from the back of the church, from the direction of the stairs leading to the bell tower. I had not noticed them when I first entered, but now I saw the dark, narrow staircase leading upward into the shadows. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run as far away from this place as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Something urged me to go on. I walked toward the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The whispers grew louder as I ascended, growing more frantic, more desperate. "Please, help me." When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was the bell tower, but there was no bell. Instead, there were a few rotting wooden beams and a floor covered in dust. The air here was colder, the temperature dropping so sharply that I could see my breath in front of me. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the old window, there was a figure. A man, hunched over, his face hidden in shadow. I could hear him muttering softly, but his words were incoherent, unintelligible. His hands were raised in front of him, as if pleading with someone, or something. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen to the spot. I couldn't look away from the figure, and a feeling of dread swept over me, thick and suffocating. The whispering grew louder, now directly in my ears, and I could hear the voice of a woman sobbing in the background. And then the figure turned toward me. It was Father Hughes. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant. His mouth moved, but no sound came from his lips. His hands stretched out toward me, and I could feel a coldness like a wave of ice wash over me. I turned and fled. I didn't stop until I was out of the church, running through the cemetery and down the hill to the town. I didn't even look back. For days after, I couldn't shake the image of Father Hughes's face, frozen in that eerie, silent scream. The whispers haunted me, following me into my dreams, urging me to return to the church. I never did. I still don't know what happened to Father Hughes or why he was there in the bell tower, but I've heard others mention similar experiences. Other visitors to the church who heard the whispers or saw shadows moving inside. I don't know if the church is truly haunted or if it's something else, some lingering darkness from the past. But I do know this. There is something in that church, something that calls out, that lingers in the air, waiting. I don't think I'll ever go back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The old church had stood for centuries at the edge of the village, its stone walls crumbling with age and weathered by time. St. Mary's Church had once been the heart of the community, a place of worship and comfort. But over the years, attendance dwindled and the congregation slowly dissipated. Eventually, the church was abandoned. No one knew exactly why. Some said it was due to the declining population. Others believed that something sinister had taken root within its walls. Grace, an investigative journalist with a particular interest in paranormal phenomena, had been hearing rumors about St. Mary's for months. The villagers spoke in whispers about strange occurrences, disembodied voices, flickering lights, and an eerie presence that seemed to hang in the air. Grace was skeptical, as she always had been. Her job was to uncover the truth, not to chase shadows or indulge in local superstitions. But something about the stories intrigued her, and she decided to visit the church herself. It was late autumn when she arrived in the village, the trees bare and the sky a dull gray. The church was isolated at the end of a narrow, overgrown path, hidden behind a veil of mist. The wooden sign at the entrance read, St. Mary's Church, its paint chipped and fading. The heavy wooden door creaked as Grace pushed it open, stepping into the cold, musty interior. The air inside was thick with dust, and the scent of decay hung in the silence. The pews, once polished and well-maintained, were now overturned, their surfaces cracked and splintered. The stained glass windows, which had once depicted scenes from the Bible in vibrant colors, were now cracked and shattered, their pieces scattered on the floor like forgotten memories. Despite the decay, There was an undeniable presence in the air, a heaviness that made the hairs on the back of Grace's neck stand up. She took a deep breath and pulled out her flashlight, scanning the dark corners of the church. The beam of light bounced off the walls, revealing faded murals and long-forgotten relics. At the front of the church, the altar stood in stark contrast to the rest of the space, untouched by the passage of time. There was something hauntingly sacred about it, as though it had been preserved for a purpose. Grace approached the altar cautiously, her steps echoing in the empty space. She ran her fingers along the stone surface, feeling the coolness of the ancient rock. As she did, a faint whisper drifted through the air, just out of reach, as though someone were speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly brushed it off as the wind. She was alone. She had to be. She took out her recorder, ready to document any strange sounds or events. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and she shivered. The air grew heavy, dense, almost suffocating. Grace felt a presence behind her. She turned sharply, her flashlight scanning the empty church, but there was nothing, just the remnants of a once holy place. She continued her investigation, determined to remain objective. She walked through the aisles, examining the broken pews and cracked windows. As she reached the back of the church, she saw something strange, a small, dilapidated door in the corner, almost hidden behind overgrown ivy. She hadn't noticed it earlier, and her curiosity piqued. The door seemed to beckon her, though a chill ran through her at the thought of going any further into the darkness. Against her better judgment, Grace approached the door and slowly turned the handle. It groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the earth. She hesitated, the air growing thicker with each passing second. But she pressed on, the reporter's instinct urging her to uncover the truth. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the damp, dark passage. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, candlelit chamber. The faint glow from the candles illuminated a large stone coffin in the center of the room. The sight made her stomach lurch. The coffin was ancient, its surface etched with intricate symbols that Grace didn't recognize. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread as she approached it, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As she peered closer, she noticed something odd, an inscription carved into the stone. It was in Latin, and although Grace couldn't read the language, she could make out a few words. In pace requiescat. Rest in peace. A soft rustling noise interrupted her thoughts, and she froze. The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and the candles flickered violently, casting strange shadows against the walls. She could feel the air thickening, pressing against her chest, as though something was drawing closer. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. Leave. Grace spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a tall, thin woman in a white gown, her face obscured by a veil. She was motionless, her hands folded in front of her as if in prayer. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back. "Who are you?" Grace demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her head, and Grace felt her blood run cold. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black as night, devoid of any humanity. The woman's mouth opened, and a low guttural sound escaped, a mix of a moan and a scream, as though someone had torn the life out of her. Grace's mind raced. She had to get out of there, but her legs felt as though they were made of stone, frozen in place. The woman moved closer, her movements slow but deliberate. The air grew heavier with each step she took, and the whispering voices returned, louder now, filling the chamber with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Leave this place," the voices chanted over and over. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, Grace broke free from the paralysis. She turned and ran up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. Behind her, she heard the scraping of the woman's feet, slow and deliberate, as if she were following. Panic surged through Grace, and she burst through the door, her flashlight shaking wildly in her hands. The church was silent when she emerged, the oppressive air lifting as she slammed the door behind her. Her heart was racing, and her mind was reeling. What had she seen? What was that thing in the cellar, and why had it tried to stop her from leaving? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. St. Mary's Church held secrets, dark and terrible secrets that should never be uncovered. Grace left the church that night, vowing never to return. The next morning, the church was silent again, just as it had always been. The whispers, the cold, the strange woman, everything was gone, as though it had never happened. But Grace knew the truth. She knew there were things in this world that could never be explained, things that lurked in the darkness, waiting to be discovered. And some things were better left undisturbed. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
It had been nearly a century since the old church had been abandoned, its stone walls weathered by time and neglect. St. Edmund's stood on the outskirts of town, a place few people dared to visit, especially after sunset. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, telling stories of a restless spirit that haunted its hollowed halls. Most dismissed it as superstition, but some of the older townsfolk were adamant. Jack, a young man with a fascination for the eerie and unknown, had heard the stories for as long as he could remember. As a child, he'd listened to the older generation tell tales of flickering lights and strange noises that echoed from within the church. But to Jack, it was nothing more than folklore. He'd spent the past year studying architecture and history, and he had made it his goal to explore the abandoned church. He was determined to prove there was no truth to the ghost stories. It was a crisp autumn evening when Jack finally made the decision to go. The sky had long since darkened and the moon hung low, casting a faint glow across the land. He'd gathered his flashlight, camera, and a few other essentials and set out toward St. Edmund's, eager to see what he could uncover. The journey to the church was a half-mile walk along an overgrown path, the trees forming a dense canopy above him. The wind whispered through the leaves, creating an eerie rustling sound. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, but he chalked it up to his nerves. After all, he was walking into a place everyone else avoided. When he finally reached the church, he stopped in front of the tall, arched door. The building loomed before him like a forgotten relic of the past, its stone exterior dark and cracked with age. A cold draft seeped from the cracks, carrying with it the scent of mildew and decay. Jack pushed open the heavy door with a creak, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. The church was silent, save for the faint sound of wind whistling through the broken windows. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the beam of Jack's flashlight. The pews were overturned, their wooden frames splintered and warped. The altar stood at the far end, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Jack moved forward, his footsteps soft on the worn floorboards. He marveled at the architecture, the grand stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible, their vibrant colors now faded and cracked. As he reached the altar, he noticed something odd, a large ornate book lying open on the stone surface. Curiosity piqued, he stepped closer and peered down at the pages. The writing was in Latin, a language Jack couldn't understand, but the symbols on the page were unsettling. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a strange pull, an urge to touch the book. Before he could reach out, a sudden sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. Jack froze, his heart racing. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and he could make out the words, "Leave this place." Jack's pulse quickened. His first instinct was to run, but he stood frozen, trying to convince himself it was just the wind or his imagination. He glanced around, but the church remained empty, save for the dust and debris. The whisper came again, this time more forceful. "Leave this place now." Jack spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. The air felt thicker now, heavier, and the temperature had dropped dramatically. He could see his breath, shallow and rapid, as he turned toward the door. But something stopped him. A figure stood in the doorway, the shadow of a person, its features indistinguishable in the darkness. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to move toward him, slowly, deliberately. The whispering intensified, now echoing off the stone walls surrounding him. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice shaking despite his attempts to sound confident. The figure didn't respond. It simply continued its approach, gliding across the floor as if it were weightless. Jack could feel the cold radiating from it, and he instinctively took a step back, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. With every step the figure took, the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispering became louder, more insistent. Jack's flashlight flickered, its beam weakening, and the shadow in the doorway grew clearer. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be. He wore a long, dark robe and his face was obscured by a hood. The figure reached the altar and paused, turning its gaze toward Jack. In that moment, Jack felt a chill run down his spine, a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't fear per se, but something deeper, more primal. He knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that this was no ordinary person. Who are you?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure remained silent, its gaze never leaving Jack. The whispering grew louder until it was all he could hear. "Leave," it said. "Leave now." Jack's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an escape. But the figure blocked the only door. The windows were too high to reach, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, its form distorting in the flickering light. Jack stumbled backward, tripping over the overturned pews, and hit the floor with a loud thud. He scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged, and his flashlight dropped from his hand, rolling out of reach. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Jack turned, and the figure was gone. The air was still, unnaturally so, and the temperature returned to normal. The church was silent again, save for the distant sound of his own breathing. Jack stood frozen in the middle of the room, his heart still pounding. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick of the mind? Before he could process it further, a loud crash echoed from the back of the church. Jack spun around, his eyes wide with fear. The altar had shifted, the heavy stone slabs now cracked and broken. From the darkness behind it, a figure emerged, no longer just a shadow, but a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Jack's scream was cut short as the figure lunged toward him, its cold hands wrapping around his throat. He fought desperately, but the grip was unyielding. The last thing Jack saw before everything went black was the twisted face of the man, grinning as if he'd been waiting for Jack all along. The next morning, the townsfolk discovered Jack's belongings scattered around the church. His camera had captured strange, blurry images of the figure standing at the altar, watching him with its hollow eyes. But Jack himself was never found. St. Edmund's Church still stands to this day, its decaying walls whispering in the wind. And every so often, someone claims to hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from within, as if the church is never truly empty. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The village of Ashcombe was small, tucked away in the hills where the fog lingered late into the mornings, and the only sound most days was the rustling of the wind through the tall grass. The local church, St. John's, had stood at the center of it all for centuries. Its tall stone tower could be seen from every corner of the village, an ever-present reminder of faith, community, and the passage of time. But as the years went by, fewer and fewer villagers came to worship there, and St. John's began to show the wear of abandonment. It was a place that held stories, and those stories weren't always of the pious kind. Most locals avoided the church after dusk. Some said it was the silence, others the strange, unnerving way the air seemed to thicken around the old building at night. Yet, none would speak too openly about the church's past, as though doing so might somehow provoke the very thing they feared. Emma, a young journalist who had recently moved to Ashcombe to take up work at the local paper, had heard whispers of the place during her first weeks in the village. It wasn't long before her curiosity got the best of her. She'd made up her mind. She would go to St. John's, document her findings, and put to rest the old legends the villagers refused to discuss. She didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. She was a rational person, a skeptic in every sense. There had to be a simple explanation for everything, she told herself. On a chilly Friday evening, Emma set out to explore the church. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, casting the village in a pale, fading light. The church loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered and cracked, a sense of abandonment clinging to it like a second skin. As she approached, she felt an odd tightness in her chest, but she shrugged it off, telling herself that it was just the wind. The heavy wooden door creaked as Emma pushed it open. Inside, the church was even colder, a damp chill that seemed to seep from the stone walls. The scent of dust and age filled her lungs, and her flashlight beam bounced off the rows of empty pews, the altar at the far end shrouded in shadow. It was eerily quiet, the silence almost oppressive. She stepped further inside, the door groaning behind her as it slowly closed with a soft thud. Emma began her investigation methodically, taking photographs of the altar, the stained glass windows, and the old pulpit. It was clear the church had been neglected for years, perhaps longer. The floorboards were warped and the air felt stagnant, like something had been trapped inside for far too long. But despite the abandonment, there was a peculiar stillness that made her skin prickle, a sense that she wasn't entirely alone. She started to walk toward the back of the church, her flashlight flickering as she moved. That was when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic thudding. At first, she thought it was the wind, the old building settling, but the sound persisted. It was faint, like a slow, deliberate knocking. She paused, listening closely. The thudding came from somewhere near the back of the church, where the aisle narrowed toward a small door leading to the church's bell tower. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond thick and impenetrable. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice unnaturally loud in the quiet space. No answer. The thudding stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Emma's curiosity surged, despite the growing unease in her gut. She cautiously approached the door to the bell tower and gently pushed it open. The wooden door groaned in protest, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. "Just a few more steps," she whispered to herself, trying to quell the unease that was slowly crawling over her. She lifted her flashlight higher and began to ascend the stairs, the beam casting long, twisting shadows against the stone walls. Each step seemed louder than the last, and her heartbeat quickened as she reached the top. At the top of the stairs was a small, dusty room. The bell, long silent, hung from a rusted mechanism, its surface covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. But it wasn't the bell that drew Emma's attention. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was an old wooden chest. It sat there, abandoned, untouched for who knows how long. She felt a sudden compulsion to go to it, as if someone was urging her forward. She knelt down in front of the chest, hesitating for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside was an assortment of old yellowed papers, brittle with age. At the top of the pile was a worn leather-bound book, its edges frayed, the title illegible from years of neglect. Emma opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. It was a diary, written in a hurried, uneven hand. The entries were unsettling. They spoke of a man, a priest, whose name Emma could barely make out. The entries detailed strange occurrences within the church, voices in the night, strange figures seen in the pews when no one was present, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to take hold of anyone who entered. The priest wrote that he felt watched, that the church itself seemed to be alive in some way, its walls and floors humming with something dark. The last entry, scrawled hastily, was dated the night the priest disappeared. It read, "I hear it now, in the dark. It's coming for me. I can feel its eyes on me, its breath on my neck. Please forgive me." I did not know what I was inviting in. Emma's hands shook as she set the diary aside, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. She stood up abruptly, her flashlight flickering once more. She needed to leave. She turned to head back to the stairs, but then she stopped. A sound. A scraping, dragging noise coming from behind her. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The chest, the one she had just opened, was moving. It wasn't much, just an inch or so, but it was enough to send a wave of terror crashing through her. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy shifting inside the room. Without thinking, Emma turned and ran down the stairs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She nearly tripped twice as she descended, her feet stumbling over the uneven steps. The scraping sound followed her, relentless, like something was closing in. She reached the bottom and bolted toward the church door. But as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the church like a clap of thunder. Emma turned, her mind racing. There was a shadow now, standing in the doorway of the bell tower. She couldn't make out its features, but she felt its presence like a weight pressing down on her. The air grew heavier still, the temperature dropping drastically. She could see her breath now, thick and frosty, as if winter had descended within the church itself. The shadow stepped forward. Emma backed away, panic flooding her system. The shadow stopped, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. Then the whispering started. Soft at first, but growing louder until it filled the church. It was a chant, low and rhythmic, something ancient and unfamiliar. The words were indecipherable, but Emma could feel their malice, their anger. She threw herself against the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, and Emma realized with horror that the voice was speaking directly to her now. "You should have never come." In that moment, the temperature plunged and Emma's body froze. A pressure in the air intensified, and the shadows around her deepened. It was as though the church itself was reaching out, pulling her into its dark, suffocating embrace. Her heart raced, and with one final effort, Emma screamed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The church was silent once more, the door creaking open as though nothing had ever happened. Emma didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She ran out of St. John's Church into the night and didn't stop until she reached the safety of her apartment. The next day, the villagers found the door of the church wide open as if nothing had occurred. Emma never spoke of what happened, but she knew she had uncovered something the village would never speak of again. She left Ashcombe shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed her, watching from the shadows. And St. John's Church? It still stands, waiting for the next curious soul to dare uncover its darkest secrets. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The old church sat at the edge of the village, its tall spire barely visible above the dense fog that settled in every evening. St. Anne's was the kind of church that was often forgotten by those who passed by, a relic of the past, its stone walls cracked and weathered with age. There were rumors about the church, of course, as there often were about old, abandoned places, but no one spoke of it openly. It was a place to be avoided, and even the most devout villagers shied away from it, despite its proximity to their homes. When Sarah moved to the village, she was drawn to St. Anne's immediately. There was something about its solitude that called to her, an inexplicable pull she couldn't ignore. She was a writer, used to the quiet, and had moved to the village in search of inspiration, hoping to find peace and solitude after a difficult year. The small cottage she rented was tucked away on the outskirts of the village, and on clear nights she could see the faint outline of the church through the trees. At first, Sarah dismissed the rumors she'd heard. "They're just stories," she told herself. No different from any other village ghost tale. But the more she explored the area, the more the village's unease about the church seemed to linger in the air. She'd often overhear hushed conversations in the market, the old women whispering about the church's dark past. Some claimed it had been the site of a terrible tragedy long ago, while others insisted the church was cursed, haunted by something evil that had never left. Sarah was skeptical, but the eerie feeling she got when she walked past St. Anne's was hard to ignore. One evening, after finishing her writing for the day, Sarah decided to visit the church. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of purple and orange, and the air was cool and crisp. She wrapped herself in a coat and made her way through the winding path toward the church. The fog had already started to roll in, thick and heavy, making the world around her seem distant and muffled. When she arrived at St. Anne's, the sight of it made her pause. The church was old, much older than she had imagined. Its tall, narrow windows were obscured by grime and moss, and the wooden doors were cracked as though they hadn't been opened in years. Despite the darkness surrounding it, there was an undeniable energy about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open. It creaked loudly in protest, and she winced, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside, the church was still and silent. The air smelled of dust and decay, and the faintest breeze seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls. The pews were empty, their wood darkened with age, and the altar at the front was obscured by shadows. The only light came from the pale moon that filtered through the broken stained glass windows, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. Sarah walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As she approached the altar, she noticed something strange. There was a small wooden door on the left side of the altar, partially hidden behind a curtain of ivy. She had never seen this door before, even though she had walked past the church several times. It was odd, considering the church had been abandoned for years. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she decided to investigate. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward into the darkness. She felt a chill run down her spine, but the lure of the unknown kept her moving forward. She descended carefully, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase spiraled downward, and the further she went, the darker it became. Her flashlight flickered briefly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The feeling of being watched crept over her, but she dismissed it, telling herself it was nothing. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was lined with dust and debris. There were shelves along the walls, some empty, others filled with old books and odd trinkets. But it was the large stone altar in the center of the room that caught her attention. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The altar was covered in strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone. There was a sense of wrongness about it, as though it didn't belong here, in this forgotten church. Sarah took a step closer, her flashlight sweeping across the altar. The symbols were unsettling, their meaning unclear but unmistakably ancient. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the stone, and immediately felt a jolt of cold run through her. The air grew heavier, and the silence became suffocating. Her heart raced, and she quickly withdrew her hand, unsure of what had just happened. That was when she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the room were alive with the voices of the past. "Leave this place." The words sent a chill through her, and Sarah spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the room. There was no one there, nothing to explain the voice, but the air felt thick, as if something was pressing against her, urging her to leave. She backed away from the altar, but before she could turn to leave, she saw something move in the corner of the room. A figure, just a shadow at first, but it grew clearer as it stepped into the light. It was a man, but his features were obscured by darkness. He wore old, tattered robes, and his face was hidden beneath a hood. The man stood motionless, his presence somehow both distant and immediate. The hairs on Sarah's neck stood on end. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice a low rasp, like gravel being dragged across stone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to flee from the church, but her legs refused to move. The figure took a step closer, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. It was as if the very air had become suffocating. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted. It pointed toward the altar. "It is too late now. You have awakened what was buried." The room seemed to close in around Sarah, the walls narrowing, the shadows pressing against her. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a mere whisper of sound. The figure moved closer still, its cold breath washing over her. She could see the hollow emptiness in its eyes, the darkness that seemed to swallow everything it touched. The whispering voices returned, louder now, as if the very stones of the church were alive with their cries. "Leave before it's too late." Suddenly, the figure lunged at her, its bony hands grasping at her, and Sarah screamed. She stumbled backward, finally finding the strength to move. Her heart raced as she sprinted up the stairs, her mind numb with terror. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She could hear the figure's rasping breath, feel its presence gaining on her. She burst out of the door and into the church, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, and the voices fell silent. Sarah stood there, gasping for breath, her body trembling with fear. The church was still, its ancient walls untouched, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees outside. She turned and ran, not looking back, not even once. The next morning, Sarah left the village. She never spoke of what happened, but the memory of that night stayed with her. Those hollow eyes, that cold touch. She knew she had encountered something that could never be explained, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. And whatever it was, it had woken up. As for St. Anne's Church, it remains standing just as it always has, its doors closed to those who would dare to enter. The villagers no longer speak of it, and the church remains a silent sentinel, holding its dark secrets within its crumbling walls. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I grew up in a small, quiet town where life moved at a slower pace. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's business and the church was the heart of the community. I was raised in a modest house a few blocks from the old church that sat atop a hill, its spire rising high above the rest of the town. It had been there for generations, and most people in town attended services regularly. I never had much interest in the church as a child. Sure, I went to Sunday school, but I was more focused on playing with my friends or getting out of chores than paying attention to the sermons. Over the years, I started hearing strange things about the church from the older generation, things that unsettled me. They were subtle comments at first, offhand remarks from neighbors or people at the diner. They'd talk about odd noises late at night or strange occurrences during services. "Don't go up there after dark," they'd say. "You can feel something, you know?" It wasn't until I was older that I began to pay closer attention to these rumors. The church had always been quiet, especially after the old priest, Father Samuel, retired. The new priest, Father Matthews, was a young, energetic man, but there was something off about him, something that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't explain why. One evening, when I was about 22, I was walking home from the library when I noticed the church door was slightly open. It had been years since I had seen it like that. The doors were always locked after the evening service. Curious, I walked closer, stopping just in front of the steps. The faint glow of the stained glass windows bathed the sidewalk in eerie, colorful light. I didn't know why I felt compelled to go inside, but I did. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the sound sent a chill down my spine. The inside of the church was almost exactly as I remembered it, but the air was thick, charged with an odd heaviness. The pews, once worn but comforting, now seemed to hold a strange presence, almost as if they were watching me. The tall, vaulted ceiling stretched up into the shadows, and the only sound was my own breathing. I noticed the smell of incense was still faint in the air, though it wasn't like anything I had smelled before. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I moved toward the altar, I saw Father Matthews standing near the pulpit, facing the back of the church. He didn't turn when I entered, and for a brief moment I wondered if I should leave. Something didn't feel right. "Father Matthews?" I called out softly. He didn't respond. I took a few more steps forward, closer to the altar. My eyes began to adjust to the dim light. At that moment, I noticed something odd about the shadows in the corners of the room. They didn't seem to move with the flicker of the candlelight. They stayed unnaturally still, like they were waiting. Suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and an unsettling thought crossed my mind. I wasn't alone. Just as I was about to call out again, I heard a faint whisper, a voice too quiet to understand, but unmistakably close. The sound came from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart began to race. "Father?" I called out again, louder this time. "Are you okay?" No response. I felt a chill run through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I began to step back toward the door, I noticed movement at the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again near the confession booth. A shadow. But it wasn't a regular shadow. It seemed wrong. It moved too deliberately, too slowly, like it was following me. I turned quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears, and to my horror, I saw the figure standing by the confessional. It was a tall man, dressed in the dark robes of a priest, his face hidden in shadow. His posture was rigid, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt his eyes on me. The air grew colder. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. Instead, I heard a low voice, barely audible but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the altar. It wasn't Father Matthews. It was someone else. "Help me, please." The voice was soft, almost desperate, as if it were coming from a great distance. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a figment of my imagination, but it chilled me to the bone. I needed to leave. Now. I backed away, my eyes locked on the figure by the confessional, which seemed to be inching closer. Just as I turned to run for the door, I felt something cold brush against my arm. It was like an icy hand grazing my skin, sending a shock of fear through me. I whipped around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through me as I ran toward the door, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The church seemed to stretch on forever, the door so far away. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The figure by the confessional was now gone, but the shadowy presence remained. I could feel it, pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I reached the door, threw it open, and stumbled out into the night air. I didn't stop running until I was home, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had seen in that church. Was it a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, or was there something truly wrong with that place? The next day, I decided to go back. I had to know what had happened to try to make sense of it. But when I arrived at the church, it was locked, just like always. The door that had been open the night before was now firmly shut. I waited for Father Matthews to arrive, hoping to speak with him about what I had experienced. When he walked past me, I stopped him. "Father Matthews," I said. He looked at me with a strange, almost distant expression. "Is everything all right, young one?" he asked, his voice soft, but somehow lacking the warmth I remembered from before. "I was in the church last night," I said, unsure how to explain what had happened. "I saw something. I heard something. There was a figure in the church, and voices." Father Matthews' expression changed. For a moment, he looked almost startled, as though he had heard something he wasn't expecting. "It's a quiet place," he said carefully. "The church, it holds memories. Don't go there alone at night." His words only added to the weight on my chest. What had he meant? Why did he seem so distant, so guarded? As the days passed, I heard more stories from other town residents. Some of them spoke of strange occurrences in the church, noises, flickering lights, and the sense that they were being watched. Others claimed to have seen figures in the pews at night, or heard faint cries echoing through the empty halls. Father Matthews eventually stopped coming to the church altogether. It was as if he had disappeared without a trace. The town began to grow uneasy. People started to avoid the church. The town's council sealed it up, and the doors were locked once more. I never went back to the church after that night. Whatever I saw, or thought I saw, has stayed with me. I often wonder if there's something to the rumors, something beyond explanation that resides in that old, silent building. Some say that Father Samuel still watches over the church, his spirit unable to rest. Others say it's the lost souls of past parishioners, still searching for peace. But I don't need to know the truth. The fear of that night, the figure by the confessional, the voice that still echoes in my mind, sometimes it's better to leave certain questions unanswered. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I grew up in a small town where the church was the focal point of the community. It stood at the top of a hill, overlooking the main road like a sentinel, its spire piercing the sky. The church was old, over 100 years, and had seen its share of history. I can't recall a time when the church wasn't there. Its stone walls faded from the passage of time, and its bell ringing every Sunday morning for services. It was beautiful, in a haunting way, but there was something about it that made me uneasy, something I couldn't explain. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the church when I was a child, always speaking in a hushed tone as if afraid someone would overhear. She told me that in the old days, the church had been a place of refuge during the wars, and people had come to seek solace there. But there were always rumors about the church's darker history. When I was about 17, I began to spend more time at the church, especially after I started volunteering there on weekends. My curiosity had grown, and I thought it would be interesting to learn more about the place. The volunteer work was mostly mundane, cleaning, setting up for services, organizing the old pews. But the more time I spent inside, the more I began to feel a strange sense of unease, especially when I was alone. There was an old bell tower that nobody had used in years. The rope for the bell had long been removed, and the tower was mostly off-limits. It was high above the main hall, and access was restricted to the priest and the church's caretaker. One day I was assigned to help with a few repairs in the church. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Evans, asked me to bring him some tools from the bell tower. I had never been up there before, but he seemed to think nothing of it, so I agreed. I made my way up the narrow, creaky staircase that led to the bell tower. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I climbed higher and higher, the air growing cooler as I ascended. When I reached the top, I found the bell tower to be surprisingly dark and cold. The only light came from a small window that offered a view of the town below, but the room itself was mostly shrouded in shadows. There was a strange smell up there too. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't quite right either. Like old books or damp wood mixed with something faintly metallic. I noticed an old chair in the corner of the room, dust-covered but otherwise undisturbed. It seemed out of place, as if someone had been sitting there recently. I told myself it was probably just the caretakers, left there years ago. As I looked around, I began to feel a creeping sense of discomfort, as though I wasn't supposed to be there. But I shook it off and grabbed the tools Mr. Evans had asked for. I made my way back down the stairs, feeling the weight of the stillness in the tower behind me. After that day, I continued to help at the church, but something had shifted. The air inside the church seemed heavier, the silence more profound. I began to hear things, soft whispers echoing through the halls when no one else was around. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, but the whispers became more frequent, and the church began to feel different, as if it was alive with something unseen. One evening, I stayed behind after a service to tidy up. The others had left, and the church was once again quiet. As I moved through the aisles, cleaning up stray hymnals and sweeping the floor, I heard it, a soft thump like footsteps coming from the back of the church. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but there was no wind that night. The church was still and silent, save for the faint sound that seemed to echo from the back. I slowly made my way toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The doors were all locked, and there was no one else in the church. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, but I shrugged it off. Perhaps it was just the building settling, I thought. As the weeks went by, the incidents became more frequent. I would hear footsteps in the nave, whispers in the corners, even the occasional soft scraping sound, as though someone were dragging something heavy across the floor. Sometimes, when I was alone, I would feel a cold draft sweep past me, even when the windows were closed and there was no breeze. The church, once a place of solace, now felt oppressive, as if something was watching me from the shadows. One night, I decided to stay late and investigate. I had heard the rumors for years, of course, stories of a ghostly presence that haunted the church, of an old priest who had died under mysterious circumstances. But I never took them seriously. Now I wasn't so sure. I waited until the last person had left, then quietly locked the doors behind them. The church was empty, its silence almost suffocating. I walked through the aisles, listening for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. As I passed the altar, I noticed something odd. A candle had been lit, even though no one had been in the church for hours. The flame flickered gently, casting long shadows against the stone walls. I approached it cautiously, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up once again. Suddenly, the air in the church grew cold. I could see my breath in the dim light, and the whispering began, soft at first, just a murmur, but then louder, more urgent. It was as if someone was speaking directly in my ear. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until I could barely make out the words. "Help me, help me." The voice was soft, desperate. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the very walls of the church were speaking. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and ran toward the door, but as I did, something caught my eye, a figure standing near the altar, shrouded in shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark robe, and though its face was obscured, I could feel its presence, its gaze locked on me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to leave, but something held me there. The figure stepped forward, and in the dim light, I saw it more clearly. Its hands were outstretched, as though begging for help. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time it was closer, as though the figure was speaking directly into my ear. I turned and bolted for the door, the whispers following me, growing louder and more insistent. I yanked open the door, and as I stepped outside, the air seemed to clear. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I was left standing in the cool night air, panting and shaking. I didn't return to the church after that night. I couldn't bring myself to. The church had changed for me. No longer a place of peace, but one of terror. Haunted by something I could neither understand nor escape. A few weeks later, I learned that Father Matthews had suddenly disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, and there were no answers. Some said he had left to tend to a sick relative. Others whispered that he had left because he couldn't handle the stress. But the rumors persisted. People started to say that the church had always been haunted, that it had been cursed from the beginning. I don't know what happened to Father Matthews. I don't know if he's still out there, if he found peace, or if he met the same fate as the priest who had died long before him. But I do know this. I can never set foot in that church again. There's something in there, something that watches, something that calls out in the dark, and I don't think it's ever going to let go. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The old church stood at the edge of town, its weathered stone walls and broken windows telling tales of time past. As a child, I would look up at it, intimidated by its size and the stories people whispered about it. There was always something about that church, an aura of unease that hung around it, even on the brightest days. I didn't understand why people avoided it so much, why it seemed to hold such a heavy presence in our small town. I grew up in a quiet, rural community, and the church was the centerpiece of our town. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, built in the 1800s, with a history that stretched back even further. People came and went, but the church remained, silent, watchful. Over the years, I began to hear rumors about the place. There were stories about strange sounds at night, sightings of a shadowy figure lurking in the bell tower, and most unsettling of all, stories about a young priest who had vanished without a trace several decades ago. Despite these rumors, I never thought much of it. It was easy to dismiss the stories as mere gossip, superstition bred from the fear of the unknown. But everything changed one cold autumn evening when I found myself standing at the church's doorstep. It all started when I came home for the weekend after my first semester at college. I hadn't been back in months, and I was eager to catch up with my old friends and enjoy the comfort of my childhood home. On Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit the church. I had always been curious, and I wanted to see it up close, especially after hearing one too many stories from my grandmother about the strange events that had occurred there. She had never been one to talk about it openly, but she would drop subtle hints, things like, never go there at night, or some things in that church just don't belong to this world. That day, the sky was overcast and a cold breeze swept through the empty streets of the town. The trees had started to shed their leaves, and the once vibrant hues of autumn had faded into dull browns and grays. The church stood at the far end of Main Street, its spire looming above the rooftops like a finger pointing to the sky. I pushed open the creaky wooden door, and as it swung open, the stale air inside hit me. The musty smell of old wood and stone filled my nostrils, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The silence was almost suffocating. The church was abandoned, just as it had always been on weekdays. Only a handful of people attended services on Sundays now. The pews were empty, and the grand altar was shrouded in shadow. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor. The stained glass windows, though beautiful, cast an eerie glow over everything. The colors of the glass seemed to bleed into the surrounding darkness, turning the light inside the church into a strange, unsettling hue. There was a thick layer of dust covering the pews, and the air felt stagnant as though the church hadn't been used in years. I reached the altar and stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. There was something about the place that made me uneasy, a feeling that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the isolation or the age of the building. It was the palpable sense of something lingering in the shadows, something ancient and inexplicable. The longer I stood there, the more I felt as though I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but as I moved back down the aisle, I heard a noise, a faint creak, like someone was walking behind me. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was just the old wood settling, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. I turned around quickly, but the church was still empty. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the church, near the confessional booth, a figure stood motionless, It was cloaked in shadow, and at first I thought it might be a trick of the light, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. It was the shape of a person, standing perfectly still, its back to me. The figure wore a long robe, and though I couldn't make out any features, I could feel its presence, intense and unsettling. My heart began to race, and an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello, is someone there?" The figure didn't move. I slowly took a step forward, my eyes never leaving the shape at the end of the aisle. I wasn't sure if I was scared or just curious, but I felt compelled to approach it. Each step I took echoed louder and louder in the silence of the church. As I drew closer, I felt a strange, icy coldness in the air. My breath became visible in front of me, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. When I was about 10 feet away, the figure suddenly turned. I froze, but it wasn't a person. The figure was an outline of darkness, blacker than the shadows around it. It had no face, no features, only an inky, formless shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, an entity that existed outside of time and space. And as it turned, I heard a voice, a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Leave." The voice was cold and distant, yet strangely familiar, as if it came from deep within the church itself. I couldn't move. Fear gripped me, paralyzing me in place. The air around me seemed to tighten, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, now." Without thinking, I turned and fled. I didn't look back. I ran out of the church, through the heavy doors, and onto the empty street. My chest was tight, and my heart was pounding in my ears. I kept running, not stopping until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't return to the church after that day. I couldn't. There was something in that place, something ancient and restless that I couldn't explain, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Later, I learned from my grandmother that the church had always been associated with strange occurrences. She told me that years ago, a priest had vanished from the church without a trace, his disappearance unexplained. People claimed they had seen him in the church, still wearing his robe, standing by the altar, long after his death. But no one dared to speak too much about it, for fear of stirring whatever restless spirit might still linger there. I don't know what I saw that day, but I know this. There are things in this world that we are not meant to understand. And some places, some buildings are better left undisturbed. The church at the edge of town is one of those places, and I've learned the hard way that some doors are best left unopened. Story the end.